questioningchristianitypodcast.com. 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 That's the way I decided to start the show today.
That is really cool, Dan.
I've heard that on the commercials, you know?
Yeah, I know. That definitely gets your attention.
It seems like it must work if so many companies will do it.
But you got to give the 800 number now.
Oh, I don't have one of those.
Oh, well.
So I'll just go questioningchristianitypodcast.com. Hey, thanks for tuning in again. This is Dan, and Rob's across the table from me.
Hey, everybody.
We try to do this thing every couple of weeks where we get together and we ask some of these questions of faith. We call it a Questioning Christianity podcast. We have a website, and I'll give you that address a little bit later in the show. Rob, how you been?
I'm good, Dan. How are you?
I'm good. We're recording this on the Thursday after Ash Wednesday. Are we in the season of Lent now?
Yeah, we're in Lent.
Are you giving anything up for Lent?
I am not. Nothing specific. No. Are you?
I rarely do, but this year I am.
Really?
Yes, I'm giving up drinking the coffee at church.
Ah, wow.
Because I had a situation.
A huge sacrifice.
Yeah, it is, because the church I've been going to is the U2 Church of Darkness here in town.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Although that's not the official name of the congregation, but all the songs do sound like U2, and it's very dark in there.
Yeah.
But they do have delicious coffee. What they don't have are lids that fit the cups very well.
Ah.
And so I went in on Sunday and I had my raincoat on because, it's rained about 98 out of the last 100 days.
Yes.
And I picked up my cup of coffee and the lid wasn't on and the coffee poured down my sleeve and got stuck in my raincoat. I got a 2nd-degree burn.
Oh, man.
So I thought about giving up that church for Lent, but I think I'll just
give up the coffee.
Yeah. It's dangerous.
Well, yeah. I'm sure that it's going to deepen your spiritual devotion.
That's right. I'll be thankful every time I go to church and don't leave in pain.
Yeah. So don't have to go to the hospital afterwards.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
We've been doing this series of shows on this very weird book from the Old Testament called Jonah.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully you've checked out the first 2 episodes in the series. If not, you can do that anytime using the internet. But this week we want to talk about Jonah's prayer. We're in chapter 2 and kind of the middle of the story. So how we got to this point was God told Jonah to go talk to these people in Nineveh, and he decided he didn't want to do that. He went the other direction and got on a boat. A storm came. Jonah ends up being thrown off the ship, and he finds himself in the belly of a fish. And so that's where we find ourselves this week in the podcast.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the weirdest parts of this little book.
It is, yeah.
I used to get hung up on that whole being in the belly of a fish thing.
Yeah, because it's, really hard to believe that would literally happen. And we've said several times that, when the first time you heard us say we're going to talk about the book of Jonah, you said, I'm not going to listen to that because I can't believe that a man could be swallowed by a great fish and survive it. Yeah. And, we said, well, you don't have to believe that it is literal, or you don't have to have a literal reading of it, but you can read it metaphorically. You can look for the message in the story, just like you can a lot of other kinds of stories. And to be honest with you, that's how I read it. I don't necessarily, I'm not going to say that God could not do that. I just don't necessarily believe that that's what this book is about. And I just don't believe that when the Jewish people read this story and retold this story, that they were, all sitting around wondering if a guy could actually get swallowed by a great fish. They were looking for the deeper meaning in the story.
Gotcha. That makes sense, and I'll literally believe it when I see Jeremy Wade catch one on River Monsters and get inside
of it, or pull somebody out.
Hey, I did have a question from last week's episode, so just to keep things kind of in chronological order, let's start with that, if that's okay. All right, so before Jonah finds himself in the ocean or the sea and in the fish, the men on the ship, they draw straws to see, who's at fault for causing this storm. They don't want to, Jonah gets the short straw, I guess, but they don't want to throw him overboard. And you talked a little bit about the different names for God last time, which was really interesting. But then there was a phrase that stuck out, and this is what I wanted to ask you about. And it says, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice, and they made vows to him. And so that's a phrase that I've heard before and has always kind of troubled me a little bit.
Yeah.
Fearing the Lord or fearing God. What does it mean to fear the Lord or to have a healthy dose of fear? If that's such a thing?
Well, I think that concept, particularly in the Hebrew scriptures, it runs the gamut of meaning. It can mean, as it does, I believe, in this particular passage, that the men were actually afraid of this God powerful enough to cause a storm and then calm a storm at will, who would not be afraid of that kind of massive raw power.
Right.
So yes, they're fearful of this God. But in Hebrew thought culture, to fear the Lord also, and probably more so, was a term of reverence, a way of saying that we are in awe of this God. And so it came to mean a positive way of affirming someone's spiritual devotion or their religious devotion.
Okay.
In fact, today, you might hear somebody say that he's a God-fearing man, or she's a God-fearing lady, or whatever.
I'm going to put the fear of God in you.
Yeah, that would probably be a more negative perspective. But anyway, it's almost always, I think, intended to be as a compliment when somebody says he's a God-fearing person. Gentiles in the first century, when they were observing Jewish practice and when they were worshiping the one true God of the Israelites, in other words, when they were moving from paganism and polytheism to monotheism and worshiping the one true God, the term that the Jews had for them was God-fearers. So if you were a Gentile and you were a God-fearer, you were seen in a positive light by the Jewish people.
Okay.
So anyway, I'm just saying that to fear God is not necessarily to be terrified of God. In fact, I don't think that that's the dominant idea behind it. It is there sometimes, but most of the time it's more a deep reverence and an awe and a deep respect and a very worshipful attitude toward God.
I gotcha. That makes sense. You know, in this story, these were pagan sailors, and so they didn't know this God, and so it makes sense for them to say that they fear him. They're scared of him, this Zeus-like kind of God.
Yeah.
But for us today, I don't know, when we talk about God being a God of love and Jesus being the clearest vision of what God is or who God is, you know, fear just doesn't go with that.
One of the writers of the New Testament, and John, I think, is saying in a letter that he wrote, he said, perfect love cast out all fear. So I think there's actually a time in the life of a disciple when how can I say this? When we outgrow this need to be terrified of God, and love replaces that as a motivator to be devoted to God. It's almost like maybe we could draw probably a poor correlation between our relationship with God and a child's relationship with his parent. There's a point in time, you know, when a kid, like my grandson did the other day, when a kid throws a rock through the neighbor's house and breaks out the window, his first thought is, my dad's going to kill me. You know, I'm afraid that I'm going to be severely punished, you know, I'll be grounded forever or whatever. When that kid grows up and his relationship with his father has somehow deepened and he has matured and he's become the kind of person that his dad dreamed that he would grow up to be, then there's no longer that kind of relationship of fear. It's not that wasn't useful at some point,
right,
but now he's outgrown it and there's only love. At least ideally.
It's always important to think of it as a process, you know?
I think so.
As a journey.
Yeah.
One of the things I found really interesting and helpful in understanding the book of Jonah was the point that you brought up about how this is more of a kind of a reverse prophecy for the nation of Israel. And so I think that same context applies to the next little bit we want to read. So Jonah finds himself inside this fish, and he prays, and instead of doing like a woe is me, he does a prayer of thanksgiving, which is a little bit unusual because the guy hasn't seemed especially thankful or positive even up to this point.
Yeah, it's almost like Jonah's bipolar, and he's you know he's one guy in chapter 1, and now in chapter 2 he's a totally different person.
Yeah, And he's going to flip again.
Yeah, he's going to flip again. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So what do we want to do here? Do you want to get into the prayer first and then talk a little bit about what it means? How do you want to handle that?
However you want to. You want to read it?
No, I think I'll have my daughter, Katie, read it.
From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them, but I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I've vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish and vomited Jonah onto dry land.
It is a very, very unusual piece of literature. And I guess say a couple of things about it. One is that the prayer itself draws heavily from the book of Psalms.
Yeah.
There are several different quotations from the Psalms. You can get a good study Bible, and it'll actually give you all the different references that are in this prayer that actually come from Psalms.
Okay.
So you can do that on your own. And here's what I would say about the prayer. I believe that Jonah is serving as a personification of the nation of Israel itself. The book is talking about this one guy, Jonah, but it's actually about a whole nation. So the whole nation is invited by God to love their enemies. The whole nation acts like Jonah and wants their enemies to be killed. But there's this one little glimpse of goodness and beauty in this prayer that's stuck in the middle of the book. When the nation is cast down, there's this ray of light. They believe in this the God that they claim to believe in, and they believe that he will deliver them, and they offer this prayer of thanksgiving. You have to remember, Dan, that Israel spent most of their history under oppression from other nations. They were either in exile or they were oppressed in their own homeland by the nations around them that were much more powerful and stronger than they were. Mm-hmm. So they had to learn to look to this God and to believe that even when they were, as it were, in the belly of the great fish, in the worst circumstances they could imagine, that this was still a good God, and that they could genuinely offer thanksgiving to him in honestly believing that he was going to be as good as his word, and he was going to redeem them. And as Jonah says here, he says at one point, he'll again look upon the holy temple. One of the things that the Israelites really grieved is that when they were exiled and they were taken out of their homeland, they could no longer meet God at the place where they believed that God dwelt, or at least the place where they believed that God met human beings. And that was in the temple in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's one prophet that while he's in the bottom of the sea, the thing that comes to his mind is, I'm not going to get to go to the temple anymore. It's the whole nation that's grieving the fact that they've been cut off from their homeland and their temple, but they dream about a time when God will come through for them, and he'll be as good as his word, and they'll get to go home. And so they're offering thanksgiving kind of in advance for that. Yeah.
So is this like an incredible case of seeing the glass half full? Or why would we want to give thanksgiving when we are in the so-called belly of the fish? You know? Or if the book's about Israel and they are under oppression, what is there to be thankful for? Or what value comes from the exercise of practicing Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Despite those circumstances.
Yeah. Well, I think that anytime, no matter what our circumstances are, this is, I think, one of the things that Israel has actually, they spent thousands of years learning this, and they have been great teachers for us so that we could learn this as well. But they have been these people who, no matter what circumstances they were under, they have made this a practice to be faithful to offer thanksgiving to God, not in some kind of a what we would call a word of faith practice, where if I offer thanksgiving, then I'm going to manipulate God into delivering me.
Okay, sort of like a barter system of some kind. Yeah,
trying to do a transaction with God, where if I express enough faith, then whatever it is I'm dreaming for or praying for is going to happen. Now, this was much more genuine than that, and it was much more intuitive and visceral for them. They would actually feel this thanksgiving in the midst of their struggles. Mm-hmm. And so that in the midst of their struggles, they could survive and they could flourish. And they did. They always have. And I think that there's something to be learned from that for us. Yeah. I think it just bleeds through the pages of this particular passage. In this journey we call life, all of us are going to find ourselves in what you might call the belly of the whale or the belly of the great fish circumstances. When everything is falling apart and everything is collapsed around us and we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel yet, it's still dark around us. But somehow, even in the middle of that, the Spirit of God moves in our lives, and we find ourselves with this capacity that's beyond us to offer thanksgiving to this God that we're reaching out to, that we're maybe even groping for. We're not denying our circumstances. Jonah said, things are bad around me. Seaweed is wrapped around my head. Yeah. You know?
Yeah, that's awful.
That's awful. He's groping in the darkness for this God that he's believed in all of his life. And in that darkness, he finds this God, and he's able to offer thanksgiving to this God. And when you find that place in your belly of the fish circumstances, in that moment, it's redemptive and it's life-giving, even before you get out of those circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Is that a moment that you can initiate somehow when you find yourselves in bad circumstances or, the belly of the fish, so to speak?
Yeah. I think to some extent, yes, and maybe no, too. Okay. I think the desire to initiate it brings us back to this kind of utilitarian relationship with God. I'm going to go ahead and pray this way. I'm not really feeling it, but I'm going to go ahead and pray this way so that it might hurry God up and deliver me sooner. And I've heard Jonah preach that way, that Jonah prayed this way and God heard him praying this way. And that's why, he caused the fish to vomit Jonah up on the land. I think that's very human, and I think we all do it.
Yeah.
And I'm not even saying don't do that. There are times when we all pray out of desperation, and that's not a bad thing. Maybe desperation is a really good incentive to pray. All I'm saying is that there are times when maybe we've been praying that way for a while. We've just been trying to faithfully grope for God in the darkness that is around us in our prayer life. And then one day, even while we're still in that darkness, something happens. The Spirit of God moves. Jesus said the Spirit's like the wind. We don't know how it's going to blow, when it's going to blow. The wind sort of has a mind of its own. But the Spirit of God moves, and even in the midst of that darkness, there's a calm and there's a peace that comes into our lives. And we're able to genuinely offer thanksgiving in that moment. What I'm saying is that's a beautiful thing. And that's something that we have truly learned from our ancient Israelite friends.
Mm-hmm. You feel like you've been able to do that?
Yeah, a time or two in my life.
I know there was you did a message where you shared some of your story about the time that you found yourself kind of in the so-called belly of the fish.
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to say a word about that to encourage you to go ahead and stick around to listen to that, because especially if your story is a story of religious performance, trying to live up to standards, feeling like that you're condemned and you never did get really saved, you didn't mean it, or when you prayed the prayer or whatever, if that's part of your journey, then for sure stick around and listen to this, because this hopefully will be something that you can resonate with. The reason we've plugged it in to this particular series is because it's definitely a belly of the fish kind of story.
Sure.
Yeah. As far back as I can remember, I have always been what I can only describe as a very spiritually sensitive person. I just can't remember a time in my life when I wasn't sort of seeking spiritually. I mean, as far back as I can remember, always asked questions, always wondered about things, sometimes to the point of agonizing. In fact, a lot of my life I've spent in spiritual agony. My parents raised me in church. I think that's a really good idea, parents. And I can remember going to worship, and I was not a still kid. I didn't sit really still a lot of the times. I would crawl up on my dad, but I was listening some. And I remember as a little guy, our pastor, we called him Preacher Turner. And he reminded you of Santa Claus. He was a short guy, a little round face. He would just so passionately and so eloquently talk about the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And I can remember him, holding his arms out and just describing for us how Jesus died on the cross to save us from our sins. And it stirred my little 6-year-old heart to the point that one day, during what we called the altar call, my older sister, she's 2 years older than I was, so she was 8 and I was 6, and she went down to the altar first, and then I went down behind her. And as best I understood what it meant to give my life to Christ, to receive forgiveness of his sins, and I hadn't really done a whole lot of bad stuff, up to that point. But I was contrite, and I was really, really sincere. I can remember basking in this wonderful feeling of forgiveness and grace. That was such a good time in my life. You guys remember what it's like to have childlike faith? Just to let God love you. Just to take him at his word. Just to know that Jesus Christ has taken care of all of your junk. I can remember that. Not long after that, I've got to be honest with you, my spirituality moved from a time of tranquility to a time of turmoil. The faith family that I grew up in might be thought of as legalistic, fundamentalism. There's different terms that's used to describe my faith tradition. And here's the thing. The faith family that I grew up in, they really, really, really believed in everything that the Bible said. And I can remember us talking about how we're saved, we're redeemed by grace through faith, not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. I can remember saying that, and I can remember talking about that. But here's the thing. I learned as I moved along that, at least in my faith tradition, what it meant to have faith was that we had this intellectual agreement with a set of beliefs, a belief system, a set of doctrines, and we intellectually believed that all of those things were true, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The only problem is that I had a hard time believing. And let's just be honest. Don't raise your hands, but anybody ever have a problem with doubt? Ever doubt anything? There was no room for doubt in my faith tradition. You didn't get to doubt. If you were doubtful, you were bizarre. And so I can remember just struggling, and I would think to myself, I must not be saved. I don't always believe all this stuff. And so I would pray over and over again. I would pray what we call the sinner's prayer. And I would say, Lord, this time I really believe. And this time I really repent. And then as soon as I got done with the prayer, there would be this little voice in my head that said, no, you don't. And so I got to be honest with you. I mean, I was a basket case. I was a spiritual psychotic through my teenage years. into adulthood, I had this tremendous struggle because in our faith tradition, that's what faith meant. Here's the way I would describe my faith struggle at this point. Faith for me wasn't really faith in Jesus Christ. It was really faith in me. It was actually believing in my ability to believe. It was placing faith in my capacity to somehow produce faith. So does this make sense to anybody but me? Has anybody ever been here and struggled with this? You see, here's the thing. It was very, very easy. With all the blessings that came to me from this faith tradition, it was very, very easy for us to slip into turning faith into works because it was up to me. I had to generate this faith. And that is just another way of working your way into heaven. Y'all following me? Am I making sense? And you throw in on top of that, hyper-Calvinism. And I decided at some point that I just wasn't one of the elect. Y'all know that doctrine, before the creation of time, God picked who would go to heaven and who would go to hell. And if you weren't one of the elect, then just too bad. Sorry, God has already written you off. And I thought that I was just written off because I did not have the faith to believe. Somewhere along the line, I just checked out. I don't think I even maybe knew when I did. I was still going to church because that's what you did. But somewhere along the line, I just decided that this was not going to be for me. So fast forward a little bit, and my wife and I met one another. And into young adulthood, having children will start making you think, right? And so I thought, my children need to be in church. The only church I knew anything about was the church I grew up in. So we went back, and I went back into the same struggle. See, here's the problem with legalism. And legalism is the belief that you've got to do something else to please God. You got to stack one more thing on top of what you just did. You got to believe more, or you've got to do more. And plus, I was just that way by nature. I was kind of an approval addict. I like to do stuff to gain people's approval. I don't know if anybody here struggles with that at all or not, but I got back into that context. Here I was doing everything in the church that a church member, an average church member could do, and I was not happy, and I was not satisfied, and I was still racked with guilt and pain and doubt and fear. And so one day I went and talked to my pastor about it. And I said, here's the deal. I don't think I'm doing enough. And of course, he agreed with me. He said, I think you're actually called to preach, and you're just not getting it. So I said, oh, that's the next thing then. So that's what I'm supposed to do. So that was my call to ministry. How does that make y'all feel? Secure? So went to school for a couple years, took my first church, and as a pastor, then I turned it into the First Baptist Church of fundamentalism and legalism. And I did that for a while. About 7.5 to 8 years after that, I went back to school again because you got to do more, right? You got to get that next degree. And so I went back to school again, was working on doing some graduate work, pastoring a local church, and sort of cruising along. I was in a church plant, and we were building a church building, and I was pretty happy with myself. But then it all fell apart. The bottom fell out. Everything fell apart. I found myself, for the first time in my life, I think, just absolutely at a loss. I was forced to resign from my church. I got fired. And here I was. The only way that I knew how to measure my worth had been taken away from me. Still in divinity school, so for 2.5 years, I finished up divinity school, and I did not pastor a church. I was in the belly of the great fish. I told you this connected with Jonah. God in His grace and His mercy began a work in my life in that 2-year span of time. For one thing, He put people in my life that began to speak into this situation.
They began to help me understand that I was using my faith as just another way to work, to earn God's favor. On top of that, for whatever reason, I'm not exactly sure why, but I found myself every morning, and I'm a morning person, so I found myself every morning getting up. I was reading over and over again the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I would get to the end of John, and I would just come back to the beginning of Matthew. And I would just read from Matthew to John, over and over and over again. And what happened for me is that I got saturated in Jesus. I discovered the Jesus of the Gospels. I began to look at this person who drew people to him that the religious system of their day had excommunicated. Jesus drew the misfits, the rejects, the messed ups. So if you're a misfit, a reject, and a messed up person, you're just right for Jesus. And that's who I was. I was cruising around in the bottom of the ocean in the belly of the great fish. And I saw this person who reached out and he touched leprous skin, and he didn't mind doing that. And he hung out with tax collectors. Who wants to do that? And prostitutes and people that nobody else. He was a magnet to these people. I don't know if I can really attach an explanation to it, but somehow in that 2-year period of time, I found Jesus. I just, for the first time in my life, I met Jesus. And so after that period of time, and God in His grace, the great fish vomited me up off the coast of North Carolina in a little place called Havelock. And I spent the next 10 years of my life trying to share that Jesus with other people. So that's the story. Here's the connection with Jonah. What happened to me, sometime during that 2-year period of time, my prayers, while I was still in the belly of the great fish, my prayers became prayers of thanks. Now, maybe you're in the belly of the great fish today. Maybe it's because of circumstances similar to mine, maybe totally different from mine. My prayer for you would be that you would find Jesus. Just Jesus. Just Jesus. Not Jesus and legalism. Not Jesus plus anything. Just Jesus. Just find the grace and the forgiveness and the goodness of Jesus. And then let your prayers become prayers of thanks.
I think maybe I have two times, I guess, come to my mind. One was a moment, not when I just went to college, but I don't know, it would have been 19 or 20 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But
so 25 years ago. I'm sorry. That was a cheap shot. I apologize.
It was before Y2K ruined everything. But there was a moment where I grew up very spiritual, and then I reached a point where it just went away.
Yeah.
It's not that I wanted it to go away, and it wasn't like I did like Jonah, I don't think, where I went the opposite way of where I was. But it was dark. It was very fish belly like. Mm-hmm. And I was in that for a while. And to be honest with you, I don't remember, like, there wasn't a moment where I realized I was out of it, but gradually. What comes to mind, someone gave me a devotional, and it had an excerpt from John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul.
Oh, yeah.
Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I attributed it to, was that was kind of my Dark Night of the Soul. Mm-hmm. So that we might put that on the recommended reading list. But I think, is that the gist of what he's talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great connection that you've made there between,
And the other one was going through a divorce recently, and that was a dark kind of time and a lot of groping for light and help.
Yeah, I think so. Even in the midst of that darkness, there's that moment, I believe, when something redemptive happens, and you don't even you have that moment of true thanksgiving even before you get back on the beach. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes, the storm's still raging, but you're okay with it.
Yeah, exactly.
You come to terms with it, or you find some peace in it, and that doesn't make any sense. Like, why? How are you able to do that?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
I think that's what makes it so beautiful and so divine, if I can maybe use that word. Yeah.
One thing, though, I wonder if folks in our podcast family, we always say we encourage questions and we encourage doubts, and that doesn't make you less of a faithful person or anything like that. But I think a lot of times when we find ourselves in these fish belly sorts of situations, I don't know, we want to think, well, we've done something wrong.
Yeah.
Or maybe I've heard, in your story, like you said, like, maybe I wasn't really saved, Is it okay? Is that the advice, just to be like, it's okay?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think when I was going through some of my spiritual development, I guess we would call it, parts of that journey were very difficult for me. I wish that I had someone around me at that point in the journey just to say, hey, it's okay. You're okay.
Mm-hmm.
You're created in the image of God, and God loves you. And that's enough for God.
Yeah.
I'm just here to say, rest in that. Take a breath and just find some peace in that thought. And hopefully whoever be my advisor would articulate it better than I just did. But
no, I thought that was beautiful. I was like, we should end the show on that.
Maybe we will.
I mean, just take a breath and rest. It's going to be all right.
Yeah, absolutely. We're just so hung up on this idea that we have somehow got to make God like us. We've got to perform for God, and God is not interested in that. He just wants to love us. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say about it.
All right, cool. I'm glad you did. Hey, if you got any questions, comments, suggestions, feedback, we'd love to hear from you. And you can do that through our website, questioningchristianitypodcast.com. You can email us through the website. You can also reach us through Facebook. We'll talk about your questions on the next episode.
If the sermon is meaningful to you, and then you probably know somebody else that it will be too, and so share it with them. And we want to try to be as helpful to as many people as we can.
The book we mentioned in this episode was Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Special thanks to Katie, my daughter, for reading the scripture. Subscribe and share, and we'll see you next time. QCP out.